Christmas dinner, 20 years into my marriage, I walked into my own dining room carrying a dish of roasted chestnuts and found another woman sitting in my chair. Not near it, not close to it. In it, the carved oak chair at the head of the table, opposite Richard's, the one I had sat in every single Christmas since the year we bought this house, the one with the small worn patch on the armrest from 2 decades of my own hand resting there during grace. Julia Marsh, 29 years old, Richard's marketing director, had a glass of my good wine in her hand, and a smile that didn't waver when I stopped in the doorway. For a moment, nobody moved. Our older son, Michael, glanced up from his phone, and then quickly back down, the particular flinch of a grown child who has learned not to referee his parents' silent negotiations. Richard's mother, Eleanor, seated at the far end, went very still, her fork paused halfway to her plate. "Julia should have the good seat tonight, don't you think?" Richard said, not looking up from carving the turkey, his tone light, almost bored, as if he were commenting on the weather rather than rearranging the geography of a marriage in front of both of our sons. "She's had a big year at the company. I think she's earned it." I stood there a moment longer than I should have, dish of chestnuts warm in my hands, waiting for someone, anyone, to say something, to acknowledge that this was strange, that this required at least a sentence of explanation. No one did. Julia took a small sip of wine and glanced at Richard with an expression of quiet, settled satisfaction, the look of a woman confirming something she'd already been promised rather than discovering it in the moment. I set the dish down. I took the empty chair at the far end of the table, the one usually reserved for whichever cousin arrived last, and passed the cranberry sauce when someone asked for it. Dinner continued around me in the particular hush of a family that has collectively agreed, without discussion, to pretend nothing unusual has happened. Richard talked about a new development deal. Eleanor asked Julia polite questions about her family's holiday traditions. I answered when spoken to, ate very little, and watched my own reflection in the dark window behind Richard's head, a woman sitting at the wrong end of her own table in the house she'd spent 20 years making a home. I didn't know yet that 6 weeks later, in a ballroom full of Richard's business partners, I would be standing at a podium, accepting the city's highest design award, while he stood frozen in the crowd, having just opened his mouth to introduce Julia as something she was never going to become. "My name is Vanessa Sinclair. I was 47 years old the Christmas a stranger sat in my chair, and I had spent 20 of those years married to a man who had built an entire public identity around a version of me that had quietly stopped existing years before he noticed. I trained as an architect. I want to say that plainly, because most people who meet me now assume I've simply always been the woman who runs the household and hosts the holidays, and that assumption is exactly the one Richard spent 2 decades cultivating. I graduated near the top of my class, took a position at a respected firm downtown, and was 2 years into what my mentors called a genuinely promising career when I married Richard and, within 18 months, got pregnant with our first son. Richard never explicitly told me to quit. That was never how he operated, not even in the early years. He asked questions instead, whether the firm's hours were sustainable with a newborn, whether it made sense for both of us to be working such demanding jobs, whether I'd considered how much daycare would eat into my salary anyway. Each question was reasonable on its own. Together, over the space of a year, they built a case I eventually made for myself, out loud at our kitchen table, believing the decision was entirely mine. I left the firm when our son was 8 months old. I told myself, the way women in this position always seem to tell themselves, that it was temporary. I remember the exact week I understood it wasn't. My old firm called 18 months after I'd left, offering a part-time position on a project I'd helped originate before my leave, flexible hours, half the salary I used to make, but real work, real drawings with my name on the title block. I brought it to Richard that evening, genuinely excited, and watched his face do something careful and diplomatic, while he asked whether I'd really thought through what that would mean for our son's routine. I called the firm back 2 days later and declined. They didn't ask again after that, and I understood, without either of us saying it aloud, that the door had closed for good. The one thing I never let go of quietly was my license. Every renewal cycle, every continuing education requirement, I completed on my own, using money from a small household account Richard barely looked at. Around year 12, a former colleague named Priya, who ran a small boutique studio that took on freelance architects for smaller residential and commercial clients, reached out about a kitchen renovation a friend of hers needed designed. I took the work under a professional alias, Ava Sterling, partly because it was simpler for invoicing through Priya's studio, and partly, if I'm honest, because keeping it separate from Vanessa Sinclair, Richard's wife, let it stay entirely mine. Over the following 8 years, working 2 or 3 evenings, a week after the house was quiet, I designed 11 projects under that name, including a boutique hotel lobby that won a small regional award I never once mentioned at home. Priya became, in a strange way, the closest thing I had to a professional confidant for nearly a decade. It was Priya who encouraged me to submit the ballroom renovation to the Design Excellence Gala in the first place, 8 months before Margaret's phone call, telling me flatly, "Vanessa, this is the best thing you've designed in 15 years. Stop hiding it in a drawer." Richard's construction and property development company grew enormously over those same 20 years, and somewhere in that growth, the story he told about our marriage calcified into something I barely recognized. At dinners, at industry events, I heard him introduce me, more than once, simply as my wife, no name attached, a possession that reflected well on him without requiring further explanation. When people politely asked what I did, he'd sometimes answer for me before I could. Some version of, "She keeps our family running," which is a full-time job in itself, delivered with a smile that made it sound like a compliment and land like a small, precise erasure. By year 18, at a company holiday party, I overheard him tell a new business partner that he'd built the company entirely on his own. With a wife who's never really been part of the business side of things, I stood 3 feet away holding a glass of champagne, and I said nothing. That same fall, the signs I'd spent years quietly reasoning away started arriving faster than I could keep up with. Richard began working later, most nights, always some version of a client dinner or a site walkthrough that ran long. He started mentioning Julia's name at our own dinner table with a frequency that felt, even before I let myself name it, slightly off. One evening in October, his phone lit up on the kitchen counter while he was upstairs, a text preview visible for the 2 seconds before the screen dimmed again. "Can't stop thinking about last night." I stood over that phone for a long moment, and then I walked away from it, went back to the stove, and told myself, it could have meant anything at all. The Christmas dinner where Julia took my chair wasn't the first sign that Richard had stopped simply tolerating my quiet presence and started actively planning around it. For most of that fall, he'd been distracted, complimentary about Julia's work in a way that went beyond professional praise, mentioning her name at dinner more often than he mentioned our sons. His mother, Eleanor, seated near the middle of the table that Christmas, had gone very still when Julia sat down in my chair, glancing at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, somewhere between apology and warning, before looking back down at her plate. No one else at the table said a word. 20 years teaches a family how to collectively look away from something everyone has quietly agreed not to name. Richard's sister, Margaret, wasn't at that dinner. She and Richard had never been especially close, 2 years apart and temperamentally opposite since childhood. But she had always been kind to me in a way that felt uncomplicated, unrelated to whatever she thought of her brother. She called me 3 days after Christmas, her voice careful in a way I immediately recognized as someone working up to saying something difficult. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," she said, "but I don't think I can sit on it either. Richard called our mother last week. He's sponsoring the ballroom renovation project for the city's Design Excellence Gala next month, the one that gets covered in every regional business paper. And he told her he's planning to formally introduce Julia there. His words were, 'Make things official, Vanessa,' in front of every major developer and partner he works with." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, and for a moment I said nothing at all. Because the strange thing about hearing confirmation of something you already suspected is that it doesn't land like new information. It lands like weight finally settling into a shape you'd already built for it. I thought of the chair at Christmas, of the champagne-colored ease in Julia's expression when she'd sat down in it, of 20 years of being introduced as simply my wife. No name required. "Thank you for telling me," I said, and I meant it, though my voice came out steadier than I expected. "I love my brother," Margaret said, "but I've watched him do this to you for years. A little at a time, and I don't think I can watch him do it in front of 300 people and say nothing. You deserve better than finding out from a stage." "Maybe," I said slowly, an idea already beginning to take shape somewhere I couldn't yet name. "I won't find out from the stage. Maybe I'll be the one standing on it." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean?" "I'm not sure yet," I admitted, "but I think I might already know more about that gala than Richard does." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, turning the name of the event over in my mind. The Design Excellence Gala. The city's most prestigious architecture and development award, one I had actually submitted a project for 8 months earlier, under the name Ava Sterling, without telling a single person in my family. Because some private, stubborn part of me hadn't wanted anyone's opinion about it, least of all Richard's. The first thing I discovered, 4 days after Margaret's call, wasn't something I went looking for either. It arrived in an email to the account I'd used for years under Ava Sterling, a routine logistics message from the gala's organizing committee, confirming venue details for the presenting sponsor's renovation project. I nearly deleted it as spam before the subject line caught my eye. Sinclair Development. Grand Ballroom Renovation. Finalist Presentation. I opened it standing at my kitchen counter, coffee going cold beside me, and read 3 paragraphs before I understood. The renovation project Richard was sponsoring. The flagship project he'd been publicly attached to for months, the one funding his big entrance at the gala, was a design I had submitted under my alias 2 years earlier, commissioned through the small studio I freelanced for a client who had since sold the building to a developer I'd never bothered to look up. That developer was Richard's company. My husband had spent 8 months telling partners and reporters he was sponsoring an award-worthy renovation, without any idea that the woman who designed it was sitting across from him at breakfast every morning. I sat down at the kitchen table and read the email 3 more times, half expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something less improbable, and they never did. The second thing came 2 weeks later, another email from the same committee, this one addressed directly to Ava Sterling, inviting her to prepare brief remarks in the event of a win, since the committee's internal reviews had the Sinclair Development Ballroom project ranked as the strongest entry in its category. I sat with that email open on my laptop for nearly 20 minutes before I could make myself close it, doing the math on what it would mean if I said yes to something Richard had no idea was even a possibility. I thought about the version of myself who had declined that part-time position 18 years earlier, the one who had folded her career back into a drawer to keep the peace. And I thought, with something that felt almost like grief for her, that she deserved to know this moment eventually came. The third thing happened by accident, the way the ugliest confirmations often do. I'd stopped by Richard's office to drop off dry cleaning, something I still did out of 2 decades of habit, and I heard Julia's voice before I saw her, laughing with one of the junior marketing associates near the break room, not realizing I was in the hallway. "Honestly, it's kind of sad," she was saying, her voice carrying the easy, careless volume of someone who has never once considered she might be overheard. "Richard's wife never really did anything with her life. I used to feel guilty about all this, but I don't know, some people just let their whole identity disappear into someone else's, right? At some point that's on them too." The associate laughed, uncertain, the way people do when they're not sure whether to agree with their boss's girlfriend. I stood in the hallway for a moment, dry cleaning bag over my arm, feeling something in my chest go very cold and very still, and then I walked past the break room without looking in, set the dry cleaning on Richard's desk chair, and left the building before my face could betray anything at all. I replied to the gala committee that same evening, sitting at my own kitchen table, the one Julia had never once sat at. Yes, I would attend. Yes, I would prepare brief remarks in the event of a win. I signed the email the way I always did, Ava Sterling, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, typing that name didn't feel like hiding. It felt like arming myself. I didn't tell Richard I was attending the gala separately from him. I didn't need to. He'd already told me weeks earlier that I was welcome to come if I wanted, in the distracted tone of a man extending a courtesy he assumed would be declined. I told our sons instead, both grown now, one away at graduate school and one working in the city, because I couldn't in good conscience let them hear about any of this secondhand. I called Theo first on a Sunday evening and told him everything. Ava Sterling, the years of quiet work, the renovation project, the finalist notice. He went very quiet on the phone, the particular stillness of someone recalculating 20 years of assumptions in real time. "Mom," he finally said, "you designed buildings this whole time and never told us?" I told myself it was for me, I said. I think I was scared of what it would cost me at home if I let it be for anyone else too. Did Dad know any of this? No, I said, not until the night I planned to let him find out. Michael's reaction, when I told him 2 days later, was quieter, angrier in a way that surprised me. "The whole she keeps our family running thing," he says at every dinner, he said. "He's been saying that my whole life like it was some kind of consolation prize for you. And you were designing actual buildings the entire time." I let him say it, I told him. That's on me too, in its own way. I'm not looking for anyone to be angry on my behalf. I just didn't want you finding out from a stage before you'd heard it from me. Neither of them asked to sit with Richard that night. Both of them asked to sit with me. In the 3 weeks between Margaret's call and the gala, I wrote and rewrote the brief remarks the committee had asked me to prepare, in the event of a win. A phrase that felt increasingly less like a hypothetical the closer the date came. I kept the draft simple, unembellished, the kind of thing I would have written 20 years earlier if anyone had asked me to describe why I became an architect in the first place. The particular satisfaction of taking something structurally sound but overlooked and giving it away to be seen clearly again. I didn't write a single word about Richard. I didn't need to. I understood, even as I wrote it, that the fact of my standing there at all would say everything that needed saying. The gala was held in the very ballroom. Richard was sponsoring the renovation of, 3 weeks after Margaret's phone call, an enormous room strung with white lights, round tables set for 300 of the city's most prominent developers, architects, and business partners. Richard arrived expecting to be the center of the evening in every sense. Presenting sponsor, industry leader, a man about to introduce the woman he intended to replace me with, formally, publicly, exactly as Margaret had warned me he would. I arrived separately, in a deep blue dress I'd bought for myself the week before, sat with my sons at a table near the back that I'd requested specifically, and watched the evening unfold from a distance Richard never once thought to look for me in. He was seated near the stage, at the sponsors' table, Julia beside him in a dress the color of champagne, glowing with the specific confidence of a woman who believes her introduction is only minutes away. Dinner passed in courses I barely tasted, the room humming with the particular energy of an industry that had turned out in force. Developers I recognized from 20 years of company events, architects whose names I'd once studied in school, city officials making the rounds between tables. Twice I caught Eleanor's eye across the room. She'd come with Richard's table but found a moment, between courses, to walk back and squeeze my hand without a word, her eyes still carrying some of the same apology I'd seen at Christmas. Margaret found me near the bar before dinner service began, hugging me tightly, whispering, "Whatever happens tonight, I'm glad I called you," before returning to her own seat, several tables from her brother's, a distance I suspected wasn't accidental. I felt strangely calm as the program moved through its early categories: sustainable design, adaptive reuse, emerging firm of the year, watching Richard grow visibly more restless each time his own category failed to be called, checking his watch, leaning over to say something to Julia, that made her laugh and touch his arm. I thought about the folder of renderings I'd kept for 2 years in a drawer. In my home office, a drawer Richard had never once opened, and felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe now as readiness. Richard stood near the end of dinner, tapping his glass, the room quieting with the easy attention of people who respect a major sponsor. "I want to thank everyone for being part of tonight," he said, "and to talk for a moment about the future of Sinclair development. This next chapter has been shaped by incredible people, and there's someone I want to formally introduce tonight as a driving force behind where this company is headed." He turned, glass raised toward Julia, who rose halfway from her seat, already smiling toward the room. Julia Marsh has been. The gala's host stepped up to the podium at that exact moment, gently reclaiming the microphone with the practiced ease of someone used to keeping a program on schedule, and announced that before any further remarks, the committee was ready to present this year's Design Excellence Award for Outstanding Renovation. The winning project, the host said, transformed a historic downtown ballroom into what our judges called a masterclass in honoring a building's bones while giving it an entirely new voice. This year's winner, presented under the Sinclair Development sponsorship. The architect behind the design is Ava Sterling. I stood up from the back table, my sons rising with me, and walked toward the stage through a room of 300 people I had spent 20 years being invisible to, my heels sounding louder against the marble floor than I expected, though I suspect that was only the silence around me making room for the sound. I watched Richard's raised glass lower slowly, confusion crossing his face first, and then, as I climbed the steps to the podium, and the light caught my face clearly for the first time that evening, something closer to disbelief. "Thank you," I said into the microphone, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. This project meant a great deal to me, both as an architect and, as it turns out, in ways I didn't fully understand until tonight. I designed this renovation 2 years ago, under a name I'd used quietly for most of my career, for reasons that had less to do with the buildings themselves and more to do with the life I was living outside of them. I didn't know, until a few weeks ago, that the developer who purchased and funded this project's completion was my own husband's company. I paused, letting the room's quiet settle around the next sentence before I said it. For 20 years, I was introduced in rooms like this one as only someone's wife. Tonight, I'm grateful to be introduced by my work instead. I'm grateful to the judges and grateful, honestly, for the timing. A ripple moved through the room, whispered questions passing table to table, as people worked out what I'd just said, a name and a face and a company sponsorship rearranging itself in 300 minds at once. Julia had gone very still beside Richard, the champagne-colored dress suddenly, looking like it belonged to a different evening than the one actually unfolding. Richard stood frozen at the sponsors' table, the toast he'd been mid-sentence through still hanging, unfinished, in the air. His hand still loosely holding a glass, he seemed to have forgotten he was holding it all. Margaret, seated 3 tables from the front, was the first to stand and applaud. It took the rest of the room only a few seconds to follow her. Richard found me near the edge of the ballroom afterward, once the applause had settled and the program had moved on to other categories, his face pale in a way I had never once seen in 20 years of marriage. "Vanessa." His voice had none of the confidence it carried 30 minutes earlier. "How long have you been doing this? Why didn't you tell me?" "I tried to once," I said, "years ago, when Theo was small. You asked whether it made sense for both of us to keep such demanding careers. I answered that question the way you wanted, and I never brought it up again, because I learned what happened to the parts of me you didn't have room for." "That's not. I never told you to give up architecture." "You didn't have to," I said. "You just made sure there was never a comfortable place to bring it back." He glanced toward the sponsors' table, toward the empty chair where Julia had been sitting minutes earlier, then back at me, something working behind his eyes that looked, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like genuine uncertainty. "The renovation," he said slowly. "You designed it. My company funded a project you designed, and I stood up there tonight about to." He stopped himself, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence in front of me. You stood up there about to introduce Julia as the future of a company, I said. That was, as of an hour ago, publicly sponsoring the work of the wife. You've spent 2 decades telling people. Never had anything to do with the business side of things. I didn't plan the timing to embarrass you, Richard. I only knew the timing was already there, waiting, whether I used it or not. Julia approached a moment later, the earlier confidence entirely drained from her face, though what remained looked more like calculation than remorse. I didn't know, she said to me quietly, about any of this, the building, or any of it. I believe you, I said, and I did mostly, though it didn't change very much about what I already knew regarding the rest. The break room, the champagne-colored dress, the year of dinners where my name had gone quietly unmentioned, while hers came up more and more. I didn't stay for the remainder of the gala. I left with my sons into a cold, clear night, the kind where you can see your own breath. And none of us said very much in the car at first. Michael finally broke the silence somewhere past the second stoplight. You were incredible up there, he said. I don't think I've ever actually seen you like that. Sure of yourself. I don't think I have either, I admitted, not in a very long time. Theo, in the back seat, just reached forward and squeezed my shoulder, and none of us said anything else the rest of the way home, because some evenings don't need narrating to be understood. By the following week, the story had moved well past our immediate circle. A regional business paper ran a piece on the gala's award results with the headline, "The husband who didn't know his wife designed his flagship project," which Richard's company's PR team spent most of that week trying and largely failing to manage. The piece quoted one unnamed source, a longtime employee, saying simply, "A lot of us had wondered for years what Vanessa actually did all day. Turns out the answer was better work than half the firms Richard's ever hired." The gala's organizing committee, citing conflict of interest concerns raised by this year's results, quietly declined to renew Sinclair Development's presenting sponsorship for the following year. An arrangement Richard had spent 3 years and a considerable amount of money cultivating, gone within a month. A larger blow came 6 weeks later, when one of the city's largest developers, a firm Richard had been courting for a joint venture for the better part of a year, redirected its next major renovation project to my studio instead. The project lead telling a mutual contact, plainly, that they'd rather work directly with the architect, who actually did the work everyone was talking about. By spring, the city's planning office reached out to me directly about a public library renovation, bypassing Sinclair Development's bid entirely, a city official mentioning, almost as an aside, that they'd followed the gala story closely and wanted the real thing this time. Julia resigned from the company 3 weeks after the gala. I heard, secondhand through Margaret, that the final straw hadn't been the public embarrassment at all, but something Julia learned afterward, that Richard had spent over a year telling her our marriage was effectively over. A line he'd apparently been using since well before that October text message ever lit up on our kitchen counter. Julia, by all accounts, hadn't taken well to discovering she'd been sold the same convenient story I'd once been sold myself, 23 years earlier, in a different shape. 2 of Richard's longtime partners quietly distanced themselves from the Sinclair name over the following month. Uncomfortable, as one of them told Margaret directly, with how Richard talked about his wife all these years, now that everyone finally understood what that wife had actually been doing. A third partner, someone Richard had worked with for over a decade, sent me a private note of congratulations that I still keep in the same drawer where I once kept my old renderings. Richard called me twice in the 2 weeks that followed, both times asking to talk things through, to figure out, in his words, how we go back to normal. I told him, the second time as gently as I could manage, that I didn't think there was a version of normal left standing to go back to. That the version of our marriage he wanted to return to had required a version of me I no longer had any interest in being. I filed for divorce in January. It wasn't complicated in the way I'd once feared it might be. There was no company ownership to contest. No shared business built on documents with my name quietly buried in them. Only 2 decades of a marriage that had, without my fully realizing it, already ended in every way but paperwork. Richard didn't fight it. I think by then some part of him understood there was nothing left to argue for. We finalized everything by early spring, quietly, without the theater the gala night might have led anyone to expect. Some endings, I've learned, don't need a second stage. I opened a small architecture studio that spring, under my own name this time, no alias, no separate account, no careful invoicing kept apart from the rest of my life. Vanessa Sinclair design, painted in simple letters on the glass door of a sunlit storefront, 11 blocks from the house I used to share with Richard. Margaret came to the opening, hugging me tightly at the door, telling me she'd never been prouder to be someone's sister-in-law, technically or otherwise. So did both of my sons, and Eleanor, quiet and a little tearful, who took both my hands in hers and told me she was sorry it had taken her so long to say anything at that Christmas table, that she'd known, in some unspoken way, for years, and had let politeness win out over the truth far too many times to count. Within 6 months, the studio had more inquiries than I could comfortably take on alone, largely, I suspect, because of exactly the kind of publicity I'd never once sought or wanted. I hired my first associate that summer, a sharp young graduate, not unlike who I'd been at 24, and started turning away projects that didn't excite me, a luxury I hadn't allowed myself in over 20 years. Priya came by the studio often those first months, sometimes just to sit in the sunlit front room with a cup of coffee, marveling, only half joking, that she'd spent a decade helping me hide my best work and was now watching me finally get to stop. I always wondered, she told me one afternoon, whether you'd ever let yourself have both, the marriage and the work, out loud at the same time. I don't think I could have, I told her honestly. Not with him. I think some part of me knew that for years and built Ava Sterling as the compromise instead of admitting it. And now? She asked. I looked around the studio at the drafting table by the window, my own name painted plainly on the glass door behind us. Now I don't think I need a compromise anymore, I said. I ran into Richard once, nearly a year after the gala, at a hardware store of all places, both of us reaching for the same aisle at the same time before we noticed each other. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe simply smaller, in the particular way people sometimes look once the version of themselves you'd built up in your mind has been replaced by the plainer, more human reality standing in front of you. The studio's doing well, he said, I've heard. It is, I said. There was a beat where 20 years of marriage seemed to hover somewhere between us, unfinished business neither of us reached for. I never understood, he finally said. How much of you I never actually knew. I don't think you were looking very hard, I said, not unkindly, and we went our separate ways down our separate aisles, and that, as far as I know, was the last real conversation we ever had. I think about that Christmas dinner often, the version of myself who set the chestnuts down and simply took the seat at the far end without a word. I don't regret my silence that night, not exactly. I think silence, when it's the only tool you have left, can still be a kind of strength, as long as it's building towards something rather than simply enduring. Mine was building toward a stage, and a microphone, and a room full of people finally hearing a name I had spent 20 years keeping safely, quietly, entirely my own. I think, too, about the text message that lit up on the kitchen counter, that October evening, the one I walked away from instead of confronting, and how differently things might have unfolded if I'd picked up the phone right then, instead of turning back to the stove. I've made peace with that choice. The same way I made peace with declining that job offer, 18 years earlier. I wasn't weak for staying quiet as long as I did. I was a woman who had been taught, patiently and repeatedly, that her value lived in how little space she took up. It took a chair at my own table, given away without a second thought, to finally teach me otherwise, if you've ever felt yourself slowly disappearing into the shape of someone else's story. I hope you remember this. The parts of yourself you protect quietly, even for years, even when no one is watching, are never actually lost. They're simply waiting for the room that's ready to see them. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever kept a piece of yourself hidden, waiting for the right moment to let it be seen? Leave a comment below, and let me know where in the world you're watching from tonight. We share stories like this one every day. Stories about quiet strength, reclaimed identity, and the moment someone finally stops shrinking to fit inside someone else's version of their life. If you'd like to be part of that journey, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember that the person you were before you started disappearing is still in there, waiting.